thanks for coming to the launch or announcement of the 2009 revision of World Urbanization Prospects from the UN Population Division. And there's some very information-filled press materials available for you. And the presentation will be by Ms. Hania Zlotnik, who's the Director of the Population Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UN DESA. And after Hania speaks, we'll take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and welcome everyone. And I'll have to start by saying that this is a task that the Population Division carries out every 2 years. Every 2 years we're checking how the world urban and the world rural population is growing, and we're following the lives of cities in terms of population of individual cities up to the size of 100,000 individuals. So there's a lot of cities that we keep in our database, but it's every 2 years that we make a closing on the data and make a new revision about the past and the future of these cities. And we have also in the audience here the people that are mostly responsible for doing this work, the chief of the population estimates and projections, Mr. Gerhard Heilig, and some of his staff colleagues. So I'm here to present the results of their studies. And we're happy to report that we have confirmed that the world population has been more urban than rural over the past year. And today, 50.5% of the world population lives in urban areas. That means 3.5 billion people. And the rest, which at this moment is 3.4 billion people, are living in rural areas. But the important thing to notice is that the world urban population is not equally distributed all over the world. In respect to major areas, we have great differences between the major areas, which are really the continents, whereas Europe, Northern America, and Latin America, and Oceania are very highly urbanized. The one that is the least urbanized is Oceania, and it has 70% of its population living in urban areas. The most urbanized is Northern America, with 82% of their population living in urban areas. We have at the other end of the spectrum, and really quite different, Asia, that is only 42% urban, and Africa, that is only 40% urban. So these, especially Asia, that is the home of 2/5 of the world population, is hugely rural still. So we are seeing also that nevertheless, Asia, because it has such a huge population, has the biggest number of urban dwellers in this world. There's also a big difference in how the urban population is distributed among cities of different sizes. Everyone has heard about the mega cities that are the ones we defined as cities with more than 10 billion people. I mean 10 million people. And these mega cities are very well known because they attract a lot of attention, but there are only 21 of them. The other big cities with more than 5 million people are more like 33, I think, and they are also quite big. Some of them are even bigger than some countries or areas in this world in terms of total population. But they do not account for a big percentage of the urban population of this world. And to show you how the difference goes, let me present you with some props over here. This popcorn shows you in that column the percentage of the population, urban population of the world living in the big cities. The B is for big. These are the ones that have 5 million people or more, and they only account together for about 16% of the world population. Now, if we go to the next lower size class, the cities that have between 1 million and 5 million population, they account for 22% of the world population. Let's call them the medium-sized cities, and they're over here. So it's a little bit more than you had in the other one. The other one is 16%. This one is 22%. We have the next size class are the small cities between 500,000 and 1 million. And they are accounting for relatively low proportions, just 10% of the world population, the small cities. And then we have the ones that we call very, very small cities. They have less than 500,000 people, and they're accounting for this amount, the whole bag of popcorn, 52% of the world population. So that means most of the urban population of the world is concentrated in relatively small urban settlements. The maximum in this spot is 500,000 people in these settlements, but many of them have very, very few people, less than 5,000. We know the cities in these three popcorn jars, the ones more than 500,000, we know them by name, address, telephone number. But the ones that we have here, we don't know them all. We don't have data for all the very small localities. We can find out how many people live there as a residual between our estimates of the total urban population and whatever we count specifically as cities. We also know that for the future, the majority, a very big proportion of the urban growth is going to be concentrated in these small cities. So 45% of the urban growth is coming to the really small cities. And that's because urbanization grows not only because the cities that exist today expand in terms of number of inhabitants or in terms of area, but also because some rural settlements become urban. And usually when they do that, they don't do it by getting to 1 million inhabitants and then becoming urban, but they do it when they're relatively small. So the transformation of small rural centers to urban is occurring in this size of cities. That's important to remember in terms of the world urbanization. Now, we have some information for you about the cities in these three jars, the 961 cities that have more than 500,000 inhabitants. The majority of them are in Asia, even though, again, Asia, I emphasize, is one of the least urbanized major areas of the world. It's also very populous, so it also has more than half of the cities that are relatively big. That means more than 500,000 inhabitants. 52% of those cities are found in Asia. And within Asia, a quarter of all those cities, the quarter of all those cities in the world are found in China. China is a very special case today because it's a country that has been urbanizing very rapidly after being very rural up to 1980. Now, what happens in the other regions of the world? Europe has only 14% of the cities in those jars. Latin America and Africa have the same percentage, about 12% each. North America, with only Canada and the United States, account for 10% of those cities. So North America is, as you know, a very urbanized place. And then Oceania only has 1%. So that's the distribution of the cities in these jars in the different major areas. Now back to China. China in 1980 had only 51 cities with more than 500,000 population. If you think of the huge population of China, at that time it was, and it continues to be, the biggest population in the world. Just having 51 centers with 500,000 population is really amazing. That means it was a very rural population. But since 1980, thanks to the rapid economic change that the country has experienced, the number of cities with more than 500,000 people have been growing extremely fast. They doubled over the next 5 years to get to about another 52 were added over the next 15 years between 1980 and 1995. And between 1995 and 2010, as today, you get more than 134 new cities added again to that thing. So they more than doubled again. And we're expecting that another 100 cities more are going to be added over the next 50 years. 100 cities of the sizes of more than 500,000. That means some of them are already in this jar, but they're growing very fast. Then, because the world is urbanizing, what's happening to the rural population is that it's stopping growing. We have regions like Europe where the rural population stopped growing a long time ago. We have data starting in 1950, and ever since 1950, the rural population has been declining, and it will continue to decline. At this moment, Europe has about 200 million rural inhabitants, and we expect it to have half that in 40 years' time, in 2050. But the more important news is that the populations of Asia and Africa, the rural populations of Asia, is very likely also going to decline in the next 40 years. Our projections show that today Asia has about 2.4 billion, and I had confused my names, 2.4 billion inhabitants in rural areas, and they're going to decrease to about 1.8 billion. That means losing a slightly more than 500 million in the next 40 years. In sharp contrast, Africa, that is still the other very rural area, will see its rural population continue to increase until 2040, more or less. It will start declining relatively late in the game, provided in both Asia and Africa, but especially in Africa, these trends will be happening if not only urbanization continues, but their fertility of both urban and rural areas declines. Because if the fertility were to continue to be as high as it's today, it's likely that both the urban and the rural populations of Africa would continue to increase, and that would make it even more of an exceptional region in the world, because in all other regions, one really has quite certainty that the rural population will start declining in the next 4 decades. Lastly, let me just mention that although we say that the whole world is half urban at this moment, there's great disparities between countries. If we look at the total number of countries today and we count countries and pieces of territory that are not independent states that we call areas, we have 230 units, counting those. And among those 230 units, 140 have at this moment more than half their population urban, so those have made past the threshold, some many years ago, some recently. But over the next 40 years, another 66 are going to cross the 50% threshold of urbanization. And by the year 2050, we expect that at most 25 countries of areas will still be more rural than urban. So you see that even at the country level, we also expect that the rural population is not going to be the majority in the majority of countries by 2050. So I think that that's all the facts that I want to summarize for you. They're all detailed in better way in the press release, and we're ready for your questions.